good morning. Welcome back to the adult formation. Glad to be back. My name is Jason Myers. If we haven't met, I think I know just about everybody in here, the usuals, as it were. I'm excited to be here for the next kind of couple weeks. So there's a small little adjustment. I didn't realize, or I realized much too late, that I'm actually going to be in Connecticut next weekend for a Gordon event thing at a church down there, which makes it hard to be in two places at once. So Father Dean has graciously stepped in, so he'll be doing the 10th, and then I'll be back on the 17th. So we're going to have the 10th and the 17th to wrap up the book of Acts. I was just saying to Bruce and Bill, I don't remember what I did last week, let alone in the fall. But apparently in the fall, we were going through the first part of Acts, and I believe we made it up through Acts 15. Again, memory may not serve me right here. And that in this spring, we were going to do the end of Acts, really to help set up our Greece trip that is happening here in just a couple weeks. I believe from this room we have Phyllis and Charles, who are going to be going on the trip. And so we leave May 21st, which is going to be here before we know it. Graduation is May 16th for Gordon. I have my last class on Tuesday. So the end of the year is wrapping up. Much easier for me than for students, as you can imagine. I have the easy part of the job. But yeah, so we will be going to Greece. So part of this was to kind of help set up a little bit of our trip there for the portion of Acts that we're going to be in. Our Greece trip really goes through the chapters of Acts 16 and 17. It's a short part of Acts, but it's Paul's second missionary journey, as it's called. And so we'll be flying through over there and then spending about 10 days doing that. Luckily, we're not flying Spirit, so I think we should be good.
We're going with the Spirit.
Yes, yeah, we're going with the Spirit, not on Spirit, because apparently the Spirit may fail. Right? The flesh is weak, but yeah. So we will be taking off. So if you can keep us in your prayers, that would be great. But it'll be fun to be in some of these places. So we're going to fly into Athens and then immediately go up to Thessaloniki, and then work our way down, just like Paul, from Thessaloniki to Philippi. We're going to do a little stop off at Delphi and Meteora, then go to Athens, and then over to Corinth, Cenchrea, and then back up to Athens, and then back home. Probably a little bit easier than when Paul did it. It took him a little bit longer. We will do it in about 10 days, which will be fun. So part of this is to kind of orient our teammates to these sections, but then of course to see what the Book of Acts might have to say for us today. Let me start with a word of prayer, and then we'll dive in. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for just the Book of Acts and the challenges and opportunities that the first Jesus followers faced in their world. And God, we think about our own world and the challenges and opportunities that await us, but the promise from you that undergirds it all, that you are with us even to the end of the age, and that you are empowering your witnesses all around the world to talk about your kingdom and see the world turned upside down. We pray this in your name. Amen. Amen. All right, so I think, as I mentioned, we finished up Acts 15 when we were together in the fall, which if you forget that completely, that actually works in my favor, so that's great. And so from there, we're looking at the book of Acts as this book of movement. So Luke is writing to Theophilus, his patron, who we believe kind of bankrolls the project known as Luke Acts. He's an early Jesus follower who wants to know, hey, what did I join? And so he gets this kind of history of the movement, and then a story about the founder, right? The gospel, the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. When we get to the book of Acts, we call it Acts of the Apostles, but as we saw in the fall, it's really a two-person show. It's a Peter show first, and then a Paul show. And we're going to see that more importantly here in the second half. But it really dominates around these two figures. In the ancient world, to get kind of technical, this would be called a collected biography. So biographies are about one person. Collected biographies are about more than one person. And so you have examples of this a little bit like in Plutarch's Lives or the Lives of the Caesars. Right, we're going to talk about multiple emperors. And so Luke may be kind of riffing off of that. We got the two big leaders of the early Jesus movement, Peter and Paul. John and Ringo weren't available for comment, but Ringo wasn't really a first century name, so probably never going to get there. We do have a job now. But so in the second half, it really shifts. Really after Acts 15, that's kind of the turning point. Post Acts 15, you actually don't hear from Peter in the story again. He literally is gone. You can search his name, it doesn't come up. And so it seems to be a strategic choice. Obviously, something happens in Peter's life. His life goes on. But Luke, if he's kind of chasing plot lines, doesn't choose to follow that plot line. We start to follow the Paul plot line. Most likely because, again, Theophilus is a Gentile. He's a non-Jewish follower of Jesus. And the church begins to emerge into this non-Jewish Gentile world through the work of Paul the Apostle, who considers himself, as he coins it, an apostle to the Gentiles. So the messenger that's been sent to bring the good news of the story of Jesus to the non-Jewish world. And so the second half of the book of Acts really traces that movement. How do all these non-Jewish people get into what was almost essentially an entirely Jewish movement up until, let's say Acts 10, right? How does this happen? Well, the book of Acts traces kind of that ethnic movement from a Jewish story, from a Jewish-centric kind of membership to the inclusion of non-Jewish members. And two key scenes in this kind of setup are Acts 10, the story of Cornelius that we looked at in the fall, which is, at least according to Acts, is the first Gentile to receive the Spirit, which is a pretty big deal in the first century. And then Acts 15, which kind of follows on the heels of that, which is really looking at, okay, if all these non-Jewish persons are coming into the movement, okay, what does that look like? Do they need to get circumcised? Do they need to follow the law? As we, I think, discussed in the fall, that had been the pattern. So if you go back to the book of, let's pick 2 Samuel. And you're a Gentile who wanders into ancient Israel and you say, this Yahweh thing sounds pretty sweet. How do I join? They would say, well, if you're a male, you're going to get circumcised and then you're going to follow the law. Because that's the plan. So that carries through the entirety of the Old Testament, all the way through the Second Temple period, until these Jesus followers, Paul, Peter, James, start to think about, what do we do when non-Jewish people have the Spirit? They receive God's presence in their uncircumcised state. So the question is an open-ended question of, we don't really have a map for this. We don't really have a handbook that tells us what to do. And so they start to, as we say, kind of theologically think through the work of God in their midst and see what God is doing. And they come to the conclusion, as they say in Acts 15, not to, quote, trouble the Gentiles, that Gentiles will not be required to be circumcised and not required to keep the entirety of the law of Moses. So this is kind of a big watershed moment in Acts 15 that really sets up the second half of the book. Namely, it lowers that bar of entry, if you want to think about it, lower in terms of some of the physicality. So the men don't have to get circumcised. They don't have to keep the law. So this makes it obviously a little bit easier for them to join. And this is what's really going to unleash the parts where we're in today, Acts 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Because now Paul goes out kind of fully authorized to share this message. And a lot of Gentiles come in to the movement. And so if you want to fast forward, thousands of years, that's why the Christian community, as we now call it, is largely predominantly Gentile. And Paul thinks through the kind of oddity of this in Romans 9 through 11. He says, how did this message come to its own people and was rejected at some level? And how has it come to a group into whom it never came in originally, and they're kind of flocking to it? And so Paul's kind of dancing around that in Romans 9 through 11 as he's thinking through this, not absurdity, but just this kind of like reverse kind of scenario. But we have a bunch of non-Jewish people really, really interested in the Jewish Messiah and in a Jewish story about the God of Israel. And so that's where we kind of sit 2,000 years later. So what we're going to look through today is kind of how Paul works through these big Gentile areas, primarily of Greece and then eventually Italy. So his first missionary journey, Acts 13 and 14, is modern-day Turkey. And sorry, I would have a screen. I forgot my dongle thing, I think as they call it. And so we're going old school today with the text itself. Acts 13 and 14 is Paul's missionary journey through essentially modern-day Turkey. And then for each successive movement, he moves kind of westward. So he moves from Turkey to Greece, and then eventually he's going to make it to Rome, to Italy. So we have this kind of westward movement of the story. And so if I had my slides, you'd see this great little map with movement, but I think you can picture that part of the world. Let me pause it there.
They're in the back of the
Oh, Perfect. There we go. That's right. Maps on the back. I spent a lot of time as a child looking at those maps when I was bored in church. It was always, they're in color, so it was always kind of fun. But yeah, so you'll see there, Paul's going to move kind of westward. Every time he does, though, if you read carefully in the book of Acts, he's always retreading his ground. So I think sometimes we think of Paul as like a McDonald's franchiser. He like sets up shop and is like, next. He's just trying to get on like the high leader scoreboard of church planning. That's not really his goal. He is pretty successful. But if you read carefully in the book of Acts, he goes back through Galatia, that first missionary journey, at least 3 times by my count, if not 4. So he's constantly in contact with these communities. So he does get there. He does set up a church. He does stay. He'll then move on because he's got other things to do. But then he writes to them. They write to him. He visits them again. And so he's constantly working with a pretty wide network, so much so that in 2 Corinthians, he talks about being exhausted. So 2 Corinthians, I think it's chapter 8 or 9. Maybe I think it's 9. He says, and am I not weak? I'm under constant daily pressure from the churches. That may be some internal conflict, but maybe just the managerial aspect of he's got communities from Turkey to Rome, right? That's a pretty wide network. And it begins to lay the groundwork much later on for what we talk about bishops and archbishops. I mean, Paul is really the central authority figure overseeing these spread out communities with their local leaders on the ground. And Paul's the one kind of in charge of all that. So that's what begins to lay the groundwork for essentially an episcopacy structure. And so Paul's kind of the leader in kind of that movement. But let me pause it there. Thoughts, questions on that really crash course on Acts 1 through 15? Anything?
Quick question. Do you think, we know from history there are a bunch of different kinds of Christian communities that respond in the first 100, 200 years. Yeah. And there were some disputes, obviously. Mm-hmm. How is it, obviously the Holy Spirit oversaw the whole thing, but how is it that Paul's model won out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we know, obviously, in Acts 8, Philip goes down to modern-day Ethiopia. They call it Ethiopia. It's modern-day Sudan. And starts a community down there. We see the Ethiopian eunuch, kind of that story. So we have lots of segments of Christianity in Alexandria, Egypt. We have it in, obviously, the Ethiopic church goes way, way, way back. That's a question that New Testament scholars have revolved around for a little while. Part of it is probably the canonization of Paul. So he gets 13 letters. He's friends with Luke. Luke is the longest gospel, and we also get Acts. So I say that kind of the footprint of Luke and Paul is pretty large. And so the ways in which we think about salvation, redemption, Jesus, are largely refracted through a Luke and Paul lens. I mean, we obviously have the Johannine corpus. We have Matthew and Mark. We have a couple other sporadic letters. But in terms of how we think theologically, it's a Luke and Paul show. Now, you have various interpretations from the kind of the Machiavellian, kind of like Paul was just a power-hungry guy who was a franchiser and just wanted his name big. That's basically German scholarship, which I find a little problematic. Others say, obviously, on the far end, well, it's just the work of the Spirit. That's just how it worked out. And then there's obviously some middle ground of probably a bit of both. Paul does seem to be pretty successful. He does translate the Jewish story pretty well. And then, of course, for us, we have to talk about the Reformation. I mean, in some ways, that Paul's central to that. And so it quickly becomes a Paul show. I think as a New Testament professor, I always want to get students to think more kind of broadly throughout the New Testament. To not have like what we call kind of a canon within a canon sometimes, where it's really, Paul and then Jesus who, right? So in some circles, it's really a Paul show. And I think that does get kind of the cart before the horse kind of scenario here. But certainly in the first century, Paul is one of the most formidable figures in the early church. And I think Acts testifies to that through his kind of meteoric rise, from persecutor to kind of central.
One thing that sort of strikes me is ironic, but also and paradoxical maybe, but also fitting somehow that Jesus would choose someone who had never physically met him or spent time with him to be the linchpin of the building of his church. And it does seem to fit with his choosing women as his first witnesses and lots of other stuff like that. Instead of choosing someone like Peter, for example, who's clearly everybody favored as being the head honcho.
Yeah, and I think Paul reflects on that in 1 Corinthians when he says, God's strength is made perfect in weakness, right? So there's this kind of paradoxical nature to the cross, to the disciples, to even himself. And I'm sure Paul probably thought it at least hysterical at some level, that at one point he was persecuting this movement, and now he's like in charge.
He calls himself the least of all the apostles.
Yeah, and he does seem to bear that kind of throughout his thing. I think Paul becomes, just a really influential person. You see that in Acts 15 and in the later parts. There is these, I think James is probably one of the early leaders, at least from what we can tell. We'll see this on the 17th. James is in charge of the church in Jerusalem. And for at least the first 30 to 50 years, that is kind of running the show. And then I think you do have this shifting of balance kind of to a Gentile movement. And that isn't to say Peter, I'm sure, was busy with things. It also comes down to what Luke chose to record, right? So, I mean, in some ways, we're at the mercy of Luke here, that he goes with Paul's line. I'm sure he could have gotten more Peter stories, but for whatever reason, he chooses not to include those. And then we just don't have any other kind of background, quote-unquote, info. We have the letters of Peter, but at least 2 Peter's doubted that Peter wrote that one. And big doubts on 1 Peter as well. That kind of plot line goes dark. And that's history, right? We would love to know certain things about other people. I was watching the BBC the other day and didn't realize that I think it's Anne Boleyn, the King Henry VIII. We actually don't have a physical portrait of her painted during her lifetime. Everything is post, and so we actually don't know what she looked like. And it just struck me. I was like, and that's like the 1500s, let alone 1500 years before that. Like our data just isn't there. That's welcome to the study of history. We wish we had more. Great. Well, as we move into the second section, so after Acts 15, the church decides, as I mentioned, that the Gentiles will not need to be circumcised. They kind of work through the logic of the Spirit's presence in their lives. And then as they address the question of the law, James has this really unique, in chapter 15, you can see it there, kind of these 3 or 4, depending how you read it, laws for Gentiles. They can't participate in porneia. They need to stop worshiping idols, and then not eat food sacrificed to idols, and things strangled with blood. So like these 4 minimal things. And what's really interesting there is it appears that James is pulling 4 laws from Leviticus 17 and 18, where back in Leviticus there were laws for the ger, the non-Jewish person in your midst, that back in the time period of Leviticus that they had to follow, and it's these 4 laws. And so it's like a one-for-one piece, and it's pretty brilliant. James says, okay, well, if we're the people of God and there's non-Jewish people in our midst, let's just give them the laws that were always there for them in the first place. So he kind of does this like workaround through the text, by the way, through Scripture, to say we're only going to apply these 4 laws to not, quote-unquote, trouble them. But they don't have to keep all 613. And so from there, it says that they sent out this decree, and it's known as the Apostolic Decree, that they then send and take around to the churches. So if you go read through Acts, in fact, in Acts 16, right at the end of verse 5, I was just doing some work on this the other day, you get the circumcision of Timothy, and then you get the report of the letter. And so they go out to all the Gentile churches and say, just so we're clear, you don't need to be circumcised, and you just need to follow these laws. And then from there, the second missionary journey kind of picks up. And so if you have Acts 16, I have the text here on my phone. So it's right after this story in Acts 15 that it says in verse 30, they're sent off, and we have the separation of Paul and Barnabas. And then in Acts 16, we meet Timothy. Now this is a really interesting story. As I mentioned, I'm working on a paper for the summer. And Acts 16 has really confounded a lot of scholarship, because you get Gentiles do not need to be circumcised. They do not need to keep the law. It's kind of official. In Acts 16 and verse 2, we meet Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium, and Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him. This is 16:3. And he took him and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. This is a very confusing person, number one. But then notice verse 4. As they went from town to town, they delivered to them the observance of the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and the elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in numbers daily. So right after you get this really official announcement, we're not circumcising Gentile males, there's always an anomaly, right? Like you make your law, you make your rule, and then you get the kind of 5-year-old question, what if, right? I know you said I couldn't do this, but can I do this, right? And we get this Timothy who doesn't really fit the mold. He's neither fully Gentile or fully Jewish, so what do, right? And so the Jerusalem declaration, the apostolic decree, is specifically referring to fully Gentile males you don't circumcise. And so what do you do if someone's ethnicity is hybrid, if they have both? And here, as I'm arguing in this conference paper, is that if any part of you is Jewish in the first century, Paul's going to circumcise you. Because there's not any problem with circumcision or being Jewish. And later on, we'll see this on the 17th, a big charge against Paul in the first century, as we hear about in chapter 21, is that a rumor is going around about him that he is, quote, telling all the Jews to forsake the law of Moses by not observing the customs and by telling parents not to circumcise their children. So in 21, we hear about this kind of rumor circulating. And so I think Luke includes Acts 16, this is the thesis of my paper, to argue that even in ambiguous cases, Paul will circumcise someone if they're Jewish. And so how much more so if both parents are Jewish and it's a baby, right? And so I'm arguing that within the kind of argument of Acts, Luke is kind of putting this in there almost like a lawyer as a piece of evidence to say, hey, wait a second, that report is false because we know Paul circumcised an adult male who was half Jewish, right? And so we get this, kind of really weird story here about the circumcision of Timothy. Scholars say that either Paul made a mistake. I can show you people who say he did an oops, where he was under too much pressure. The kind of commentary scholarship around this is kind of nuts. But here's where we get the big shift. In Acts 16:6, it says Paul receives a vision about a man from Macedonia. This is verse 9. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia pleading with him, saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. So Macedonia is Greece. It's the kingdom of Philip of Macedon, right? That kind of northern Greek kind of rim, even today. And so this is that move, right, from Turkey over to Greece. And Paul says a vision is what compelled him to move. And so sometimes when we talk about these as missionary journeys, we like to problematize that a bit, because this is how Paul gets the idea. He doesn't sit down like we're doing on our trip and saying, let's go to Greece. We'd love to see the sights, right? This is a vision that compels him to go somewhere. And we'll see throughout Acts, right, sometimes the Spirit prevents them from going somewhere. Sometimes the Spirit opens a door. And so if you're a planner, this is the worst way to do a trip. You're going to have a lot of anxiety, right? Because it's like, where are we staying? You're like, I don't know. The Spirit's going to tell us. You're like, I feel like you should have called ahead. What if there's not room in the inn, right? And so Paul is not your travel planner. Charles and Phyllis, don't worry. I don't plan like this. We have reservations. We will be staying there for certain nights. But this is not, again, how we typically plan our trips, right? Paul is doing this much more, again, guided by the Spirit to these. So he gets this vision. But what becomes interesting, we see this kind of, I don't know if Luke is being a little bit coy. The first person we meet when we get to Macedonia is not a man, but a woman, right? We meet Lydia in Acts 16. That's the first person we technically meet. And so you get this kind of like dissonance. There's this man calling, so you expect to read on and go, okay, who's the dude, right? Who's calling them? Like, they're supposed to maybe go see this like appointed person, right? Yet the first person we meet is Lydia, this follower, we think a Jewish follower of the synagogue that Paul meets right as he gets to Philippi. Now there is some debate here. This man from Macedonia, the most famous man from Macedonia is a little one, Alexander the Great. And so some wonder if Luke is kind of playing off this kind of most famous person. He's now, in some sense, what's the word I want to use? Missionizing, right? The island of, or sorry, the landmass of Greece, which of course Alexander the Great was very much involved in conquest of the entire region, and now we have this Jewish story coming over, right? And then this idea of needing help, right? We need help, says the man from Macedonia. So some see a kind of Alexander the Great tradition maybe behind this of kind of reconquest or battle of cultures kind of element there. But when we get to this section, it's worth noting that this section of Acts is really, really important for Paul as a person. We're going to get his longest stay with any community in this section. So in Ephesus, it's going to be 18 months. Corinth is 18 months. Ephesus is 2 years. And so this is a very long period a very significant period of Paul's life in terms of his ministry. It's about 3.5 years within 5 chapters. And so again, as you look at the text of Scripture, we're not reading a day-by-day journal. Luke has collapsed 3.5 years of material down into 5 chapters. And so he's obviously syncing up all the data. What's really important in this, and James Dunn, a great New Testament scholar, pointed this out, is that almost all of Paul's letters were written during this period, between Acts 16 and 18. He writes Romans from Corinth. He writes Ephesians from this region. He writes 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So this is a very productive, if you want to call it, if you're looking at Paul's CV, his resume, he's got a lot of things within this little 3.5 year period, and then he kind of cools off like we all do, right? He's trying to get a job. No. He's he's writing his books, right, in this period. And then he got his tenure, and then he's like, I'm done. He's like, I'm finished. I'm so tired. But this becomes very, very productive. And again, we get Romans and Galatians from this period. And so perhaps no period of Paul's life was more significant for his life and his ministry, let alone the subsequent Christian history, than what we sometimes call this Aegean mission. There's something about this period for him that is highly, highly productive in this. Paul is certainly the main character. He dominates all the stories going forward. This is why we call it the Paul Show. And this is going to be, the second half of Acts is going to be dominated by this journey, and then something that we usually skip over, the prison and trials of Paul. So Acts, essentially from 20 onward, Paul is going to be on trial for this accusation, starting in 2021, that he is teaching Jews to forsake the law. And this is actually going to narrate the last third of the book, because he's going to go from court to court. Now, we typically kind of fall off in the book of Acts after about 18. We get the riot at Ephesus, that famous, Artemis the Great, and then we kind of skip to the end of Acts. But that last third is Paul on trial. He's going to be thrown in prison, and so he's kind of moving from one place to the other, kind of dodging court cases as it gets kind of pushed again and again. And so we'll take a look at that on the 17th. When we spend our kind of final time together. It's a really neglected part of Acts, but I'm becoming convinced that it probably is one of the main reasons why at least Luke wrote in the first century, is the most significant figure has a pending legal case against him. That seems kind of significant, right? Like if your leader is going to be thrown in jail, you may want to know if he's innocent or guilty either way, right? Like if he's innocent, well, then it's wrong, but if it's guilty, then we got some questions to ask, if our leader is now in prison serving time. That seems like something a community might want to discuss if they, want to keep going with this guy. And so those last chapters are really dedicated to this trial scene. So when we get to Acts 16, it's going to kick off this important section. It's also important for Luke. So I might have mentioned this all the way back in the fall, but this is the first time we get Luke joining the story. So in Acts 16, we have these famous, beginning now, we sections. So if you notice in 11, notice in verse 10, he had the vision that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. Acts 16:11, we set sail from Troas and took a course straight to Samothrace. The following day to Neapolis. Notice 16:16. One day as we were going to the place of prayer, we met a slave girl who had a spirit of divination. So the author joins the story. Luke is part of, we think, this 16 through 26. This is actually good ancient Greek history writing. Greek historiographers love it when their authors join the action. They love it when you have some eyewitness as the author. So if you're in Greek histories, they like them to be at the battle and kind of narrate the scene. Of course, as you might imagine, there's a big debate on whether or not those we passages are authentic or are they fictitious, right? Like changing a pronoun from he to we is only one letter, right? And so there is this big debate in scholarship on whether or not these passages, is Luke really with them or is Luke making this up? I'm convinced that I think Luke is with them, because I've always been convinced that if you're going to start making stories up and placing yourself at certain events, why wait until 16? Acts 15 is the climax is like the high watermark of the book. If you're an author, you want to be in the great Jerusalem Council. You want to be, at Pentecost, right? Like, why not put yourself in the upper room? There seems there would be lots of other places that Luke would maybe want to insert himself to give credibility and kind of that kind of movement, and certainly within his lifetime. From Acts 2 to Acts 16 is only about, 10, 15 years. And so it seems that if Luke was really going to start making up we passages, you would almost expect those a little bit earlier in the book and not near the end. And so I think that they are authentic. I think Luke is part of this, and so he's narrating kind of what the parts of the journey that he's involved with. It's also probably why these last chapters are just highly, highly detailed. We get a lot more detail, a lot more context. We get a lot less of what we call those summary statements that we saw in the early part of Acts. So if you remember Acts 2, 42 through 47, the great sharing passage that they shared all things in common and no one had need, those actually drop out in the second half of the book. Because Luke doesn't need summary statements anymore because he probably has a lot of stories and he's probably trying to figure out which ones do I include. And so 16 becomes important not only for Luke as an author, as he joins the story, but certainly for this community at Philippi. So we're gonna, some of us will be at Philippi in a couple weeks, and it's a beautiful site. And what we find is that Paul heads out to find a house of prayer in chapter 16, the first part. So he says in verse 13 of chapter 16, on the Sabbath day we went outside the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. Now this is somewhat of the term where we get our language of synagogue from. And so Paul, if you notice, he's starting with Jewish groups. So wherever Paul goes throughout Acts, he goes to the synagogue first, typically gets kicked out, and then moves to the Gentiles. And he seems to keep that as a consistent pattern through Acts. And so when he gets to Philippi, his first question is, okay, where are the Jewish people? We're going to start there. So who he meets is this woman named Lydia, and she gets this really interesting label, just like Cornelius. It says that she is a worshiper of God, a God-fearer. And so what we meet is Lydia. I think I accidentally said she was Jewish. We think she's a Gentile, but notice he's going for where prayer is happening. So he's trying to go towards potentially where a synagogue is, and he happens to meet a God-fearer. This is the same label that Luke uses for Cornelius. And it appears to be Gentiles who are, at minimum, pious Roman worshipers. Because that's literally what it means. It means a fearer of God. Or if we think what Luke is narrating, especially with Cornelius, it's someone who might be attracted to the Jewish movement, but hasn't officially converted, quote unquote. They haven't become a proselyte. So he meets Lydia. And what becomes interesting here in chapter 16 is that Luke is telling us how the community at Philippi started. So a lot of Acts is giving us, in some ways, the backstory to the letters. So later on, Paul's going to write to the Philippians, and this is kind of the founding story. And what we find interesting here is that at least in 16, 1 through 15, when Paul first starts, there's only women mentioned. So notice along with Lydia, she was there, and we sat down and spoke to the plural women who had gathered there. That gathering language, some have surmised, it's hard to prove, that the community at Philippi may have started out with all women. That in its first, I don't know, week, month, year, it was entirely a woman-led community, congregation. And so that means that what we're thinking here is Lydia is most likely the leader of that community. Typically, we have a named person in an account. They're the person who kind of starts the house church. And what we find here in Acts 16 is that it's Lydia's house that becomes the place for Christian worship. So it says it in the account, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home. Come and live with us. We're going to put up hospitality for you. But we believe that Lydia's house probably becomes the place of early Christian worship at Philippi. And it isn't always a one-for-one, but typically if that person is named, they're probably the house church leader. And so as we think about that kind of broader conversation about the role of women in early Christianity, Lydia becomes really, really important along with the women with her in terms of who's leading that community. So we might have actually a female-led, if not an entirely female community at Philippi when it first begins. Now, of course, by the time we get to Philippians, we know there's some other guys involved, but we still get this kind of basis here. And Lydia is a fascinating figure. I think we talked about her a little while ago. Let me pause it there on Lydia. Yeah, Bill?
So she's described as a seller of purple cloth.
Yep.
I mean, can we infer that she is a widow acting as an entrepreneur with the business that her husband had? I mean, purple cloth is special cloth, expensive.
Yeah, so Lydia's occupation has been a site of lots of investigation. I do find it interesting, Paul will typically mention husbands and wives if they're both Jesus followers. So we're going to meet in 18 in Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila. So husband, wife. In Romans 16, 3, I think, verse 3, you meet Andronicus and Junia, husband, wife. And so it appears that if both persons are believers, they're both mentioned. So scholars come to this and say we've got one of two options. Either her spouse is not a believer, so he's not involved at all in entirely what she's doing, or more likely we believe that she's probably widowed. And so we do have a large rising widow class in the first century of women who basically inherit a lot of wealth when their husband dies, not from him, from their father. So I think we talked about this maybe last spring. Remember, there's two types of marriage in the Roman world, marriage with hand and marriage without the hand. It sounds very pedantic, but it means a lot of money for you if you know the difference. But most marriages in the first century are, quote, without the hand, which means your dowry and all the money that your father saved up for you stays on your father's side. It doesn't get transferred to your husband's bank account. If you get married with the hand, then yes, everything goes over to the husband. All your inheritance, all the land. And as I mentioned maybe last spring, there's a lot of dads who are going, wait a second, I worked really hard for this. And what do you mean when I die, an entire transfer of wealth moves Roman families? And as you imagine, some Roman males are going, I don't really like the sound of that. I want to keep our money in the family. And so they start marrying without the hand, which is a legal term, which basically means all the resources stay within the family. And so when a woman's husband dies, and her father's dead, and this is going to be likely because remember, there's about a 10 to 15 year age gap between men and women in marriage in the ancient world. And so it is almost certain that women will be widowed at least once in their life in the Roman world. And so what you see is this emerging class of women in the first century who've been married without the hand that come into a large sum of money at a certain point of their life when their husband has died and their father's died, and all of a sudden they have a lot of wealth. And so we think that roughly, I think if I remember right in the survey, 1/3 of property in Rome was owned by women, which is huge. And if they have 3 children, this is another project I'm working on, they're allowed to actually make those business decisions by themselves. So unless a woman has 3 children, they have a guardian, a tutor, that has to sign off on any business or large transaction for very bad reasons. If you want to get into it, they don't think they should be making, they think they're making rash decisions. selling property. I'm sure the women are like, how hard can it be? Right? And so if they have 3 children, then they're allowed to sell property on their own. And so Lydia kind of emerges in this Roman world as this kind of quote unquote, as they're calling it, new woman, who is independent of men, has property, has wealth, and is using it for their own purposes. And so she, as I tell students, she's a business owner. She works, I joke with students, in the fashion industry, where she sells purple cloth, most likely to someone in wealthy quarters, because purple is a very expensive color. I know it's associated with the House of Caesar, kind of imperial colors, because of the way that it's made. So either way, she's very wealthy. Again, she owns a home, which is very important in the ancient world. It's very rare to own your own home, as I morbidly joke with my students, as it's becoming very increasingly uncommon today. Welcome back to the 1st century. We are regressing. But that she has all these indicators that she's a very wealthy person. And so what we see, and I think this is part of Luke's aim, both with Theophilus and people like Lydia, is that as the wealthy come into the community, this is the transformation that happens. They use their resources to benefit the community. So this is, as I mentioned maybe back in Acts 2, although Luke doesn't give us the summary of like they held all things in common and didn't regard their possessions as their own, Acts 16, I think, in Luke's way, is echoing that story. Notice Lydia is opening up her home, one of her possessions, for the benefit of the community. And so I think, going all the way back to Luke's gospel, it's the transformation of the wealthy person. When you meet the story of Jesus, when you encounter Jesus, your relationship with your possessions changes. That may mean selling them and giving it to the poor in terms of proceeds, but at minimum, it means saying, my possessions are not my own. They're here for the resources of the community. How can I help? And so for some people in the early Christian community, that means I have more than one home. I don't need that many. And so I'm going to sell, like in Acts 2 and 4, I'm going to sell land and I'm going to sell homes and give that money to the apostles to meet the needs of the poor. Or at least at minimum, in stories like Lydia, I'm going to use potentially, we don't know how many houses she owned, the one house that I have as a place of Christian worship so that we have a place to gather. Because again, there are no church buildings in these days, right? They're not meeting at the synagogue. And so they have to meet in the homes of the wealthy because, like today, they're the homes that are big enough to house a group of 20 to 30 people. We think on average, the Pauline communities are about anywhere from the numbers I've seen, 16 to 28, maybe no more than 30. And then you start a new house church. And so in places like Rome, we think there may have been, based on Romans 16, 6 to 7 house churches in Rome. Because again, you get too big and all of a sudden you're, on top of each other. And if there's a meal involved, like in early Christian worship, you're going to have a big enough dining table, right? And so when you hit a certain number, then you break off and then you have another community. And so it isn't until much later that we get these large, kind of First Baptist of Rome, right? We're not there yet. We're in these little fledgling house churches amidst the broader warp and woof of a city. So what we see here is this is how these communities begin, whether that's Thessaloniki, Philippi, Ephesus. This is why Luke is giving us these stories. This is where the movement began. So for Theophilus, he's seeing, remember, Theophilus is the reader of this story. He's looking at Lydia's story and going, oh, I actually have a lot more in common with Lydia than the next woman we're about to meet in the story, the Pythian slave girl. And so as Theophilus is reading the story, he's going, oh, look at what Lydia did. What is Luke trying to teach me here? We don't know how many houses Theophilus owned, but I'm assuming a good number. I'm sure he has lots of possessions. And so he's reading these stories and saying, okay, if this is what it means for Lydia, what does that mean for me? And that's probably our question today is as we read these stories, we're supposed to identify with the characters, however we identify with them. And some are a little bit more identifiable for us than others. And that's supposed to be the point. There's this ethical imitation happening, right? You're supposed to see the story and go, oh, I look like that person. And I think what's important here in the story is that we have a lot of women in the account of Acts. There are women all over the story.
Is there any critique of Lydia being a leader? Or
Not that we know of, yeah. By the time we get to Philippians, Lydia isn't named in the book of Philippians, which if it's writing, a little bit later, maybe she's passed away. But we do get women leaders mentioned in Philippians, and they're not critiqued. There's actually positive statements there that the church is being led by 2 women. Because we do find out about a disagreement between 2 women in Philippians, which makes interesting sense. Again, I think the texts are a mirror, right? Sometimes, and so lots of times they say, oh, these two women were squabbling over something. They're fighting in Philippians. And many people say, oh, it's just women fighting with women. But like, if you think about it, maybe it's a leadership struggle. Like, who's supposed to be in charge? Like, it's all about what you bring into the assumptions of the text onto why they're fighting with one another. And maybe they have a disagreement like Paul and Barnabas had at the end of 15. They're saying, I don't think we should do this. So yeah, the text almost becomes a mirror, right, in many ways of what we think. And so especially with Acts 16, right, Lydia is not just setting up the casserole, setting up, the room, like she's most likely leading the community there because it's her home. And so that might not always be the case, but typically I wouldn't see a Roman citizen or a non-Jesus follower saying, use my home for a Christian gathering. That would be a little weird.
But as we assume do we assume all women are married, but then when we see a male character, we don't always assume that they're married?
Yeah, so single men in the Roman world could get by. You could still go be a senator, you could still go be a philosopher. Most likely everyone in the ancient world is married. I mean, it is the thing. But what you see emerging is this class of single persons. I think Lydia's widowed, but I think people like Chloe, people like Phoebe, potentially, may be single women. And I think this goes back to Paul's counsel in 1 Corinthians 7 to remain single. And so this is, I keep saying project, this is another project I'm working on, that looks at the marriage laws in light of all these single people we meet in Paul's communities and how out of the ordinary that would be. I do think for women, it is very clear that's a very precarious life to choose. So we talked today about you can get married, you can remain single, and we're all kind of kosher with that. In the ancient world, for a woman to choose that is to largely risk her future.
Because Luke is single.
We don't know about Luke, yeah.
Or Paul. Paul is single.
Paul is single in our story. Most of us think that Paul is also widowed at some point. It sounds really super scholarly. People essentially say he talks like someone who's been widowed. When he talks about marriage, he doesn't talk about someone who's talking about it from the outside. He seems to be talking about it with some experience. But yeah, there's no story of Paul being married. That's a really weird part, right? The two major founders of the Jesus movement, i.e. Jesus and Paul, are both peculiar oddities in the first century. They're unmarried men. And so many have noted that the New Testament's talk of marriage, family, sexuality is already starting off on a kind of odd note, and that marriage and family is not the dominant frame for the leaders. And I think that comes to shape. And of course, Paul's going to lean into that in 1 Corinthians 7 and 8, where he says, it's my preference that you would remain single. And again, for Roman citizens, this is a tough pill to swallow. Again, you have legislation from the Roman Empire penalizing through taxation not getting married, and then giving benefits if you do get married and have kids. And so it's something the empire is interested in, and here's Paul in the first century saying, maybe not. But what that means for those women, I think, is quite different. Because for them, when they get to a certain age, and like Lydia, unless they have income coming in passively, what's that going to look like for their elder years? Because there isn't going to be a social safety net to take care of them.
And you can't birth more kids.
Yes. Yep.
Beyond a certain
Yeah. So the reason why you have kids in the ancient world is, I think we all know, is that that's your end of life care. I mean, there's no nursing homes, there's no anything. Your children take care of you, and it's the reversal, right? You took care of them, they take care of you, and that's how human civilization has functioned for millennia. And so that is why you would have kids. And so these people not having kids, that's going to be a very interesting point there. So I think when you talk about care for one another in the text, we often read these texts, again, they're a mirror, but we don't think about persons who are advanced in age in the text. And all that love your neighbor as yourself, take care of one another, carry one another's burdens. We shouldn't be thinking about a mid-career 40-year-old. We should be thinking about what does it look to take care of people in your midst. At least in some texts, have pursued a life of singleness. Who's helping them get food? Who's helping house them? What does that look like for that community? And again, sometimes we don't have answers to that, but I think it gives us room to think imaginatively about how that first century world would have looked quite different than our own. And maybe points where we, dare I say, could learn something from the ancient text. But what does it look like to care for, persons, whether young or old, within a Christian community? All right, we go till 10:15, is that right? Yeah, almost done. All right, so I'm probably going to save Acts 17 for the 17th. Oh, that's perfect. I'm not going to forget that. Acts 17th on the 17th. But what you're going to see here in Acts 16, one kind of note, is that Luke always pairs a male and female story in the text. So as you go through the story, he's always pairing that. Some of that's just good symmetry. He likes a nice balanced account. And so we get the big story of the Philippian jailer as well. And so those two stories kind of dominate there in this place. Philippi is interesting as well for Luke. One of the reasons why we think Luke joins in this moment is that Philippi was, as Luke calls it, a leading city. It was a very important city in the first century. And interestingly enough, Philippi was known for its school of medicine. Now again, as I mentioned probably 6 months ago, don't think about medicine like you do today. It's very much a trial and error process in the first century. You probably don't want to go see a doctor. But we're starting to put together some pieces. We meet Luke somewhere around Philippi. He's called a physician. There's a leading medical center in Philippi of a school. Some of these pieces start to make a little bit of sense of why Luke would be like, hey, I'm in Philippi. Maybe that's where he met Paul when he first came there. Interestingly enough, he doesn't include his own, you'd think Luke would tell, here's how I met Paul. Well, we don't even get that story. Because again, Luke is, putting himself certainly out of the spotlight here in this section. But yeah, let me pause it there. We'll end a little bit early today. Thoughts, questions on this part of Acts 16? Yeah.
So there's a long tradition, I'm not sure the grounding for it, that Luke, the writer of Acts, is himself a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Is that connected all with the medical establishment in Philippi?
Yeah, we think there's some sort of overlap for why he doesn't appear in Corinth or why he doesn't appear. Now, again, some scholars would say, well, he inserts himself. He may not even be a physician. So again, New Testament scholarship can be hypercritical of almost every line of the New Testament text. And again, I'm looking at Germany. Because that just was like slicing and dicing through the text. But yeah, that probably is why we meet him there. But again, physician, a lot of enslaved people were doctors in the first century. And so even when we think about enslavement, that also gets very different. Most of your teachers, most of your doctors, even some lawyers, almost all of your scribes were enslaved persons. And so again, we need, that's a different world than we have it today, where you would have an enslaved person do that task. And so lots of enslaved persons were educated in the ancient world. That makes a big difference between how we talk about what happened in the 1800s. That education was actually key to that process because they're doing certain tasks. They're running businesses. They have their own bank accounts. I mean, they're handling funds for high wealthy people. They're doing business transactions. So yeah, the enslavement piece, we don't know if Luke was enslaved, but that also kind of puts a different nuance on some of these conversations in the first century world. Yeah.
Sort of rewinding a little bit to the question of where he begins to show up in the text, and the fact that some scholars say, well, this aligns with this Greek practice, and so therefore it's fictional. Everything follows is probably fictional. And I love your point that why didn't he insert himself in the more glorious moment that he was going to? But why do you think? Here's my question: why do you think it is that there's this skeptical bent that wants to say this is fictional, rather than just accepting it as what it presents itself to be? What's the agenda driving that? Is it to discredit the text, or is it to? I mean, what's behind that?
Yeah, there's probably at least three answers. I think one, it depends on the perspective of the scholar. So there's certainly, and I'll probably say this one, I'll spend the least amount of time on this one. There certainly has been throughout New Testament studies an attempt to discredit the New Testament because of the claims that it's making for insert anything, right? So there is this like, well, Christians write the story that they want, they win, and so it's highly skeptical. I wouldn't say, I mean, there's always that portion of scholarship. I think the more middle of the road is that, and this is part of historical critical study, is that we want to study these texts just like we would any other ancient text. And so we are skeptical of Suetonius when he says this thing happened. We're skeptical of Xenophon or Tacitus or Cicero. And so back in the 1800s, they basically said, if you're going to apply that critical lens to Suetonius, why aren't you applying it to Luke? Why does the Bible get special treatment? And that's really where the historical critical study of the Bible in the 1800s, when the study of the text came outside the church and moved into the university, the question, and this goes back to like the 1500s, of like, why are we studying the biblical text differently than we study any other text? And so that became at least the rails on which saying, okay, we want to take a more skeptical approach just to text in general. And that's obviously rooted in a philosophical framework of skepticism of power, a skepticism of authors. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, skepticism, any classic text can only go so far.
Right.
Because if you believe anything, then all ancient history disappears. So
Yes. Yeah, there's an irreducible minimum that sometimes gets lost. So, for example, people doubt that Paul wrote the pastorals just the same way they doubt, any Loeb text that says pseudo-Aristotle. And so they're saying, we're just doing the same thing. But I think sometimes where it goes too far is that history is always, in some sense, a hypothesis. Because we don't have all the data. We have to go on sources that might be good, indifferent, or bad, right? Like sources have quality to them. Certainly within the 1800s, the push was to say, the Bible's being held up over here in this special little encapsulated vacuum, and we don't think it should be there anymore. And so that's really where a lot of this got started. Yeah.
One of the things just one last thought. One of the things that occurs to me here is that if we approach the text with the same set of tools, literary analysis and so forth, that we would have for other texts, if it is in fact what it presents itself to be, in the long run, there's a benefit to approaching it skeptically, so that you can clear away the obstacles from saying, this is what it presents itself to be.
Yeah, so the historical criticism is a double-edged sword. So as much as it has been used to kind of take a scalpel to certain things, I think N.T. Wright said this, I think it was G.E. Lessing, the kind of Lessing's ditch guy. In that era, they wanted to use history to disprove Christianity. And Wright says, by pulling back the curtain of history, what they found was in some ways the text was far more reliable than they ever imagined. Now, that doesn't say it solves all problems, but there is to say that history is, because we believe in historical faith, that history is not something we should be scared of. And there are times where the text is brilliantly kind of like dead on, but there are portions where we go, that dating is a little interesting. I don't know, I think when you determine why something is wrong, how you evaluate that judgment says a lot. Is it intended? Is it an accident? Is it just an ancient person working with ancient sources? They didn't have ChatGPT and Google, right? They're only as good as their sources. But to say like someone intended something for a negative purpose, I think is a conclusion. It's not an argument. You'd have to prove that. To say Luke is doing this for a negative reason, he could be naive and innocent and just say, I thought this is what happened. So to improve intent in historical sources is even harder. But that's where the work of historical criticism really thrives. Saying, okay, I think the piece for me is that and there's different ways of reading this, but I think the message that Luke is sharing, I think like that has to be evaluated as well in terms of this doesn't seem to be there just to prop up the way things are. And so if you're inventing stuff, man, this is a really hard story to kind of keep going. You're asking the rich to give up all their stuff. You're asking those with things to help out those who don't. Seems you could probably invent a better story at some level. But yeah, that's the historical criticism is this double-edged sword. But that's the world we all live in now post, the 1800s. Is because of the dominance of Christianity, there was this, let's take a look at the claims. And that's where you get to see in the 1800s with the Enlightenment, the separation of sacred and secular, the church and the university. And so because we're in that world, there's no going back. you're then at the kind of beck and call, and we could do a whole other session on this on the rise and fall of biblical studies. There was a sense of we're going to treat the Bible like a science experiment. So we're going to get our criticisms going, so we all have the same tools. We're going to put the text through like a science experiment, so we all get the same conclusion. And that didn't work out. But the idea was we're going to study the text like a scientific enterprise, because we're in the height of scientific inquiry. So if we can figure out gravity, and if we can figure out, the laws of physics, we can figure out this text. And was true in some ways, but not true in others. But yeah, that just introduced the skepticism in that. That whole field is really fascinating. That's the world we live in now. Even within broadly, dare I say, like evangelical criticism, we're still using the tools in some ways of an endeavor that was not entirely friendly at the beginning. And some sort of circles I run in, still not entirely friendly. I can point to some places on Twitter where we get kind of reamed. If you have any sense of like belief kind of in the text, then you're biased and shouldn't be trusted. But yeah, it's a weird. It's our own circus. We have our own monkeys, and it's the world we live in, and it's the circus I prefer. So, there. All right, let me finish it there. We'll see you in 2 weeks, and we're going to wrap up the second half the last couple chapters of Acts. All right, see ya.